My name is Madison Clark. 3 years ago, my parents told the world I was dead. They stood in front of our church, cried crocodile tears, and held a memorial service for me while I lay broken in a hospital bed. My sister Hannah brought flowers to a grave with no body whispering secrets to a headstone she thought held her sister. But I wasn't gone. I survived. And today I've come back to Everett. Not to haunt them, but to take back my life. When I walk into Hannah's wedding, 200 guests will see the truth, and my father's first words won't be joy or relief. They'll be a scream. Why are you still alive? If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The morning light slipped through the thin curtains of my hotel room in Everett, painting the walls in a pale gold that felt almost too gentle for the storm twisting inside me. I stood in front of the mirror, my hands resting against the cool counter of the bathroom sink, staring at a face I still sometimes didn't recognize. The scar on my left cheek caught the light, a faint silver line now, but sharp enough to remind me of everything I had survived. I traced it with my fingertip, not out of vanity, but because it felt like touching the proof that I was still here, still alive, no matter how hard my parents had tried to erase me. The navy blue dress I had chosen clung neatly to my body. Simple, elegant, nothing too loud. I didn't want to upstage the bride. My heels sat waiting by the bed, nude and modest. I adjusted the silk scarf around my neck, pulling it just high enough that if someone looked too closely, it would cover the scar without making it obvious that I was hiding something. My hands trembled as I tugged at the fabric. It wasn't just about hiding the scar. It was about hiding the ghost my parents had created when they told the world their daughter was dead. I leaned closer to the mirror, eyes burning, and whispered to myself, "Do I even look like her anymore? Do I look like Madison Clark, the girl they buried in words and whispers?" My reflection didn't answer, but the silence pressed down on me like it always did. To them, I had been dead for years. To everyone in Everett, I was a memory carved into a gravestone that never held a body. My chest tightened as a memory pushed its way forward. The clipping from the Everett Daily Herald, folded and creased from too many times in my hands, flashed in my mind. A photo of my father standing at the pulpit of St. John's Church. His face streaked with false tears, my mother holding a handkerchief. My sister, Hannah, clutching a bouquet of lilies, as if she were actually grieving me. The caption beneath had read, "Community gathers to remember Madison Clark, taken too soon." I closed my eyes against the image, but it clung to me sticky and cruel. I opened the drawer of the nightstand beside the bed and pulled out my purse. The clipping was inside, tucked into a small envelope. I slid it out and looked at it once more. My fingers left faint creases in the already wrinkled paper. I didn't know why I kept torturing myself by looking at it again and again. Maybe because today, finally, it wouldn't just be mine to carry. Today they would see it too. Today everyone in that church would hear the truth. A knock on the wall next door jolted me back into the present. Someone else in the hotel laughing, a door slamming shut. Life going on as if mine hadn't been stolen. I exhaled shakily and sat on the edge of the bed. My heart wouldn't slow down, not even when I pressed my palm against it as if I could force it to calm. I wanted to run. I wanted to grab my suitcase, check out, and drive straight back to Seattle, where Daniel was waiting, where safety and love wrapped around me like a shield. But another part of me, the louder part, whispered that this was the only chance. If I didn't do this now, Hannah would go on believing I was in the ground watching her from heaven, and that lie would haunt us both forever. I slipped the clipping back into my bag and zipped it up with hands steadier than they had been moments ago. I stood, slipping on the heels, testing them on the carpet, and forced myself to walk a few steps across the room. Every sound, the click of the heel, the rustle of fabric, felt too loud, like the world announcing my presence. I caught myself muttering, "Get it together, Maddie. You've survived worse." My voice cracked halfway through, but the words steadied me all the same. The window overlooked the parking lot, and beyond that, the quiet streets of Everett. Familiar and unchanged, as though the years I had been gone meant nothing here. The sight made my throat tighten. How could a town stay exactly the same while I had been broken and rebuilt piece by jagged piece? How could they gossip over coffee and donuts at the diner about how tragic my death had been while I was still breathing just an hour away? I pressed my forehead against the glass, eyes closing, and imagined Hannah's face when she saw me. Would she scream? Would she faint? Or would she run to me and hold me the way she used to after nightmares when we were children sharing a room? I wanted that moment, but I was terrified of it too. Terrified of seeing confusion twist into betrayal when she realized our parents had lied to her every single day for 3 years. The clock on the nightstand ticked closer to noon. My time was running out. The ceremony would start soon, and if I meant to walk into St. John's, I had to leave now. I picked up my purse, heavier than it should have been with that clipping inside, and slung it over my shoulder. My fingers tightened on the strap until my knuckles went white. I walked back to the mirror one last time. My reflection stared back, eyes sharp. Chin lifted the silk scarf hiding the scar just enough. For a heartbeat, I saw the frightened girl who had begged her father to love her again. Then I blinked, and she was gone. Only the woman remained. A woman who had survived a crash that should have killed her. A woman who had built a business from ashes. A woman who had been buried alive by her parents' pride and was about to claw her way out in front of the whole town. I leaned in close and whispered to my reflection. Today, the truth walks in with me. My lips barely moved, but the weight of the words anchored me. I gripped the strap of my purse tighter, squared my shoulders, and headed for the door. The year was 2018, and the air inside my parents' house always felt thick, like the walls themselves carried rules I couldn't quite breathe under. My father, Richard Clark, ran that house the same way he ran the bank where he worked. By the book, every decision weighed against how it looked to the community. My mother, Margaret, kept everything spotless, from the church bake sales to the way my sister Hannah's hair was brushed into a perfect wave each Sunday morning. At 23, Hannah was the kind of daughter people in town pointed to as an example, polite, cheerful, volunteering at Sunday school. And me, I was the one who asked too many questions, the one who rolled my eyes at the gossip after services, the one who never seemed to measure up. I spent most nights working late shifts in Seattle, taking whatever freelance design jobs I could land, anything to get out of Everett's suffocating circle. It was one of those nights that I met Daniel. He was in his 2nd year of residency, still in scrubs, dark hair mussed from too many hours in the emergency room. I was sitting in the hospital waiting area, sketching on my tablet while waiting for a friend's discharge paperwork. He glanced at my screen, smiled, and asked, "Do you always draw people when they look their worst?" I remember laughing, telling him it was practice. That small exchange turned into texts at midnight coffee breaks, squeezed between shifts, and a feeling I hadn't had in years, being seen for who I was, not who I disappointed. When I told my parents about him, I used his first name, only careful not to add details. "He's a doctor," I said one Sunday after church while Mom wiped down the counters. Dad barely looked up from his newspaper. "Doctors are respectable," he muttered, but there was no warmth in it. Hannah asked questions, curious, supportive in that hesitant way siblings are when they don't want to take sides. I could see her trying to be happy for me, though her eyes flickered toward our father as if waiting for his reaction. The first time Daniel came to Everett was on a Friday evening in October. I remember the smell of roast chicken filling the house, the way Mom had set the table with the good china. Outwardly, everything looked welcoming, but the moment we stepped inside, the air changed. Dad's handshake was firm, too firm, the kind meant to test. Mom smiled politely, offered Daniel a seat, but her eyes slid over him like she was memorizing every detail to pick apart later. Hannah bounced in with her usual bright energy, genuinely glad to meet him. She chatted about teaching practicum, about how she was nervous starting at the elementary school in town. Daniel listened attentively, asked her questions, laughed in the right places. He always had a way of making people feel comfortable, almost everyone. Dinner started with small talk. Dad asked about Daniel's residency, where he'd gone to school. Stanford undergrad, then med school at UCLA. Daniel answered his tone easy. Mom nodded but didn't smile. Dad's next question was sharper. And your family? Where are they from originally? Daniel didn't flinch. My parents live in San Francisco now. My father immigrated from Guangzhou in the 70s, my mom's from Monterey. He said it like a simple fact because it was... But the pause that followed was heavy. Dad chewed slowly, his jaw tight. San Francisco, he said finally, like the words tasted bitter. Different world out there. I wanted to kick him under the table, to scream at him to stop. Daniel handled it with grace, turning the conversation back to medicine, to the long hours, to the satisfaction of helping people. Hannah asked about the ER wide-eyed, and Daniel explained a case about a boy who'd swallowed a coin. Mom laughed faintly at that story, but the sound was brittle, as if forced. After dessert, Daniel excused himself to take a call from the hospital. The moment he left the room, Dad put down his fork and turned to me. His voice was low, controlled, the way it always was before he got angry. That boy isn't right for you, Madison. He doesn't fit this family. Mom stood at the sink drying a plate too slowly, her silence louder than words. I clenched my fists in my lap. He's kind. He's brilliant. He respects me. Isn't that what matters? Dad's eyes narrowed. Respect won't save our family name when people start talking. We don't mix with his kind. The words sliced through me. My chest burned. His kind. You mean hardworking, intelligent, caring. You mean someone who actually loves me. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. Hannah shifted uncomfortably. Dad, he seems nice. Maybe you should give him a chance. Dad shot her a look that made her shrink back into her chair. Enough, Hannah. This isn't about being nice. It's about who we are. This family has a reputation in this town, and I won't see it dragged through the mud. Mom finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Madison. Sweetheart, think about your future. Think about how hard it will be for your children, how people will treat them. She turned back to the sink before I could answer. Daniel came back into the room just as the tension reached its breaking point. He smiled unaware and thanked my mother for dinner. Dad forced a polite nod, but his eyes were cold. When Daniel and I finally stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, I could feel the heat of my father's warning still burning in my ears. Daniel squeezed my hand. Rough night, I nodded, blinking back tears. You have no idea. He didn't press, just held my hand tighter. Later that week, Dad cornered me in the kitchen while Mom folded laundry nearby. You're making a mistake, he said quietly, his voice like steel. You're dragging this family's name through the dirt. People at church are already asking questions. He leaned in closer. You think love will protect you, but love doesn't last. Reputation does. And you're throwing it away. Mom didn't look up, but I saw her shoulders stiffen, her hands folding a towel again and again like she couldn't stop. My throat felt dry, but I managed to say, I'm not the one who should be ashamed here. His jaw tightened, his eyes hard. If you keep seeing him, you'll regret it. Don't forget where you come from. The words landed like a warning carved in stone. I left the room shaking, both furious and heartbroken. Upstairs, I locked the door and sat on the bed, pressing my hands against my face. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just disapproval. It was something deeper, uglier. It was a line they were drawing, and I was already standing on the other side. By early 2019, the tension in our house was no longer something that could be ignored. Every time I came home from seeing Daniel, Dad was waiting in his chair like a judge, ready to deliver a sentence. He would ask where we went, what we talked about, how late I stayed out, his questions sharp and meant to dig. If I mentioned anything about Daniel's residency or his long shifts at the hospital, Dad would sneer. Too busy for family life, isn't he? Mom rarely spoke, but her silence always agreed with him. At first, Hannah would slip into my room after those arguments, sit cross-legged on my bed and whisper, "Don't let them get to you." He seems really good for you." I clung to those words like a lifeline, believing my little sister saw me, believed in me. But as the months dragged on, even she grew quieter. When Daniel came to pick me up, she found excuses to stay in her room. When Dad started ranting in the kitchen, she would leave quickly, eyes cast down, too scared to take my side. It was like watching the last person in my family retreat behind the wall my parents had built. The night it all came crashing down, I had been sitting in the living room turning the simple ring on my finger over and over. Daniel had proposed the evening before, nothing elaborate, just the two of us in our tiny Seattle apartment. A takeout dinner and him dropping to one knee with a shaky smile. I'd said yes without hesitation, tears spilling down my cheeks. It was everything I wanted. Simple, real hours. Now I sat in the living room of my parents' house, the fire crackling in the fireplace. Hannah curled up grading papers, Mom knitting Dad with his newspaper spread wide. My heart thudded so hard it almost drowned out the tick of the grandfather clock. I cleared my throat. "I have something to tell you." All three looked up, waiting. I held up my hand, the ring catching the firelight. "Daniel and I are engaged. We're getting married next month in Seattle." The sound of Dad's newspaper crumpling was like thunder. He shot to his feet so fast the chair scraped against the floor. His face flushed red. "Absolutely not." His voice cracked with fury. "I'm 25 years old," I said, trying to steady my voice. "You can't stop me." "As long as you live under my roof, you will follow my rules," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me. "And my rule is you will not marry that man." Mom's knitting needles slipped from her hands, clattering against the hardwood. Her voice was shaky. "Madison, sweetheart, think about what you're doing. Think about your future children, how this will look to everyone we know." I felt heat rising up my neck. "I am thinking about my future. I'm thinking about being happy with someone who loves and respects me. Isn't that what you taught us to want?" Hannah put her papers aside, her voice small. "Maybe we should all calm down and talk this through." But Dad's jaw was set, veins bulging in his neck. "There is nothing to discuss. You make your choice right now, him or us. You cannot have both." The room went silent. I looked from my father's blazing eyes to my mother's tear-streaked face, to my sister's pleading expression. My chest ached with a pain I can't put into words. I whispered, "Then I choose him." Dad spat on the floor. "Then you are no daughter of mine. Get out of my house. Don't ever come back." The tears came hot and fast, but I didn't let him see me break. I walked upstairs on legs that felt like they could give out at any second, grabbed my suitcase and began pulling clothes from my dresser. My hands shook so badly I could barely zip the bag. Behind me, the door creaked open. Hannah stood there, eyes wide, face pale. "Maddie, please don't go," she whispered, rushing toward me. She clutched my arm. "Maybe Dad will change his mind. Maybe if you wait." I hugged her tightly, burying my face in her hair. "He won't. You know he won't. But I'll always love you, Hannah. Always remember that." She sobbed into my shoulder. "I don't want to lose you, you won't." I promised, though. Even then, I knew it was a lie. "You'll always have me, just maybe not here." Downstairs, I could hear Dad pacing his heavy footsteps like hammers against the floor. Mom's muffled crying seeped through the walls. I pulled away from Hannah, wiped her tears, and picked up my suitcase. As I walked down the stairs, Dad stood at the bottom, arms crossed, face hard as stone. Mom leaned against the wall, clutching a tissue, unable to meet my eyes. No one spoke. The silence was so sharp it cut deeper than any words could. I reached the door, my hand on the knob. Hannah trailed behind me, her breath shaky. "Don't go," she whispered again, but her voice broke halfway through. I turned the knob, pulled the door open, and stepped into the cool night air. The smell of pine trees and damp earth filled my lungs, a stark contrast to the suffocating air inside. I dragged my suitcase down the porch steps, my heels clattering against the wood. Hannah stood in the doorway, framed by the warm glow of the living room. Her face was wet with tears, her hands balled into fists at her sides. The door slammed shut behind me with a finality that echoed through my chest. It was the sound of a chapter closing of a family severed. I walked to my car, loaded the suitcase into the trunk with trembling hands, and slid into the driver's seat. My breath came in shallow gasps. For the first time in my life, I had no home to return to. When the engine roared to life, I gripped the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Behind me, the house stood silent, the windows glowing, the place that had raised me, now nothing more than walls and memories. My eyes blurred with tears as I pulled away, knowing I wasn't just leaving Everett that night. I was leaving the family I had fought so hard to belong to, and they had already decided I was gone. Rain hammered against my windshield so hard it felt like the sky was trying to drown the city. The wipers screeched back and forth in a frantic rhythm, but they couldn't keep up. Seattle nights were always wet in late November, but this storm was different, angrier, heavier. My little sedan hummed along the slick pavement headlights, cutting through sheets of water, and for once I didn't care how bad the weather was. I was smiling, humming along to the radio, the contract folder sitting on the passenger seat, like proof my life was finally turning a corner. Clark Design Studio had just landed its biggest client, yet a downtown restaurant chain that wanted me to redesign their entire brand. Months of hustling, endless nights, and here it was. I couldn't wait to tell Daniel. I imagined his tired face lighting up when I walked through the door of our apartment, the way he'd spin me in his arms, despite his sore shoulders from 12-hour shifts in the ER. The light ahead flicked red, and I eased to a stop. I tapped the steering wheel in time with the music, a silly pop song I probably wouldn't even remember tomorrow. That's when I saw it. The faint glow of headlights in my rearview mirror coming fast, way too fast for the weather. At first I thought the driver would slow down, but the lights grew brighter, larger, filling the mirror until there was nothing else. My stomach dropped. A semi-truck, its grill towering above, barreling toward me on slick asphalt. Oh God, I barely had time to whisper it before the world exploded. Metal screamed. My body jerked forward, the seatbelt tearing into my chest. The sound was deafening, a roar of impact and shattering glass. Pain lanced through my leg. My head slammed against something hard. And then the world went black. When I opened my eyes again, the first thing I saw was a pale ceiling blurred with fluorescent light. My throat was raw, every breath jagged, and tubes snaked from my arms. I tried to move, but pain screamed up my left leg. I gasped, and a sob tore out before I could stop it. Madison. The voice was hoarse, broken, but I knew it instantly. Daniel was slumped in the chair beside me, dark circles carved under his eyes, his scrubs wrinkled. He reached for my hand, gripping it so tight it almost hurt. "Oh, thank God. You're awake." My lips cracked when I tried to speak. "What happened?" "You were hit at the light. A semi couldn't stop on the wet pavement. You've been out for 3 weeks." His voice shook like saying it aloud might break him. I lifted a trembling hand toward my face and felt the thick bandages wrapping my cheek. Panic clawed up my throat. My face cuts from the glass. "The surgeons did everything. There'll be scars. But you're here, Maddie. You're here." His tears dropped onto our joined hands. I tried to swallow my voice, barely more than a rasp. My leg broken in 2 places. They put in pins. "You'll need months of therapy, but you'll walk again." I closed my eyes, relief and terror crashing together inside me. Then another thought slammed into me. "My parents." "Did you call them?" Daniel froze. His grip tightened, his jaw working. "Daniel?" My voice cracked, almost pleading. "Did you call?" He nodded, slowly, eyes glistening. "I called the night of the accident. I told them you were in surgery, that it was bad. I begged them to come. And..." His silence stretched heavy and suffocating. Finally, he whispered, "Your father said you made your choice, that you were already dead to them." The words hit harder than the truck ever could. My chest seized breath, hitching as if someone had punched me. "No," I croaked, shaking my head against the pillow. "No, he wouldn't." Daniel's tears spilled freely now. I called again. "Maddie, I tried." He wouldn't answer. "Your mom wouldn't either." "They've shut the door." The room spun. The machines beeped steadily beside me, mocking me with their calm. My own parents had been told their daughter was fighting for her life, and they had answered with nothing but a burial of words. I pressed my hand to my bandaged face, and a sob ripped out of me. Daniel leaned closer, pressing his forehead to my hand. "Don't you dare believe them. You are here. You're alive. They don't get to take that away." But the pain was too much, a grief so sharp it hollowed me out. Hot tears slid down my cheeks, stinging the wounds beneath the bandages. I cried not just for my body broken on that road, but for the final death my parents had sentenced me to with a single phone call. In that sterile hospital room under the harsh lights, I realized I hadn't just survived an accident. I had been killed twice. Once by a truck in the rain, and once by the family who decided my life no longer mattered. I was sitting up in the hospital bed, the tray of untouched food pushed to the side, when the nurse came in with a young woman trailing behind her. At first I didn't recognize her, not until she smiled nervously and said, "Madison." "It's Jenny. Jenny Parker. We were in choir together." Her voice cracked and the smile faltered. "I'm so sorry for your loss." I blinked at her, confused, my head tilting. "My loss?" My throat was still raw from tubes and medication, the words rough. Jenny's eyes darted to Daniel, who was standing stiffly beside me. She stammered, "Everyone back home, the service, we thought—" She stopped herself, cheeks flushing red. "I shouldn't have come in. I just wanted to offer condolences." And before I could ask her what she meant, she ducked out the door, leaving behind a silence that seemed to press against my chest. I turned to Daniel, my pulse rising. What was she talking about? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled an envelope from the pocket of his jacket, his fingers trembling as he handed it to me. "I wasn't sure if I should show you this, but you need to see it." Inside was a folded copy of the Everett Daily Herald, the date at the top reading January 12, 2020. My hands shook as I opened it, the paper crinkling loudly in the quiet room. There it was, my name in bold letters, "Community Gathers to Remember Madison Clark." A picture beneath the headline showed the sanctuary of St. John's Church, flowers draped across the altar, a framed photo of me at 18 smiling stiffly in my senior portrait. I kept reading even though my eyes blurred with tears. Pastor Williams was quoted speaking about a young woman taken too soon who brought light to our church. My father Richard was described as choking back sobs as he said I had lost my way, but would always be remembered as the daughter they loved. My mother Margaret was said to have clutched Hannah's hand, whispering about God's mercy, and then the words that sliced me open. Hannah's voice, quoted in the article. My sister Maddie was my best friend. I'll miss her laugh every day. She'll always be with me. I couldn't breathe. I pressed my hand to my mouth, the taste of salt filling it as tears streamed down. I felt like I was drowning inside my own skin. Daniel moved closer, his hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry, Maddie. I didn't want you to find out this way. But the whole town, they all believe you're gone." The paper slipped from my hands, falling into my lap. I stared down at my own obituary, written by strangers, rewritten by my parents. No mention of Daniel. No mention of the life I had built outside their walls. Just a version of me they could stand to remember, the obedient daughter they wished I had been. The rage came fast, hot, and sharp. I grabbed the water glass from the tray and hurled it against the wall. It shattered pieces, scattering across the floor. The sound echoed loud and violent before silence swallowed the room again. I screamed, then a raw sound that tore out of me before I could stop it. Years of hurt, betrayal, and now this? A funeral while I still had a pulse. They buried me. I sobbed, my fists pounding into the mattress. They buried me alive. Daniel tried to catch my wrists, murmuring my name, but I pulled away, curling into myself. I could still see the image burned into my mind. Hannah holding flowers, crying at a coffin that held nothing. My parents crying crocodile tears, all while I was lying broken in a hospital bed. The betrayal was so complete it hollowed me out. My parents hadn't just disowned me, they had erased me, rewritten me into a story that made them comfortable. And Hannah, my sweet sister, believed it all. She was grieving me while I was still breathing, still fighting. I sat there gasping, shaking tears, soaking into the hospital gown. Daniel leaned his forehead against mine, whispering, "Don't let them define you. Don't let this be the end of your story." But in that moment, I felt dead in every way that mattered. The world outside those hospital walls believed I was gone, and my family wanted it that way. I wiped at my swollen eyes, the decision hardening in my chest like stone. I would not go back to Everett. Not to that house, not to that church, not to that town that mourned me while I was still alive. I turned away from the clipping from Daniel's worried eyes and closed mine. In the darkness behind my lids, I told myself the truth. Madison Clark no longer had a family in Everett. They had chosen to bury me, and I would let them live with that choice. From that night on, I stopped thinking of Everett as home. By the spring of 2020, Daniel and I had carved out a corner of life in Seattle that finally felt like ours. We rented a modest one-bedroom apartment in Queen Anne, and I turned the spare nook by the window into a makeshift office. It was nothing more than a second-hand desk, a laptop, and a printer that jammed twice a day. But to me, it was the birthplace of Clark Design Studio. My first client was a coffee shop near Pike Place Market. I remember sitting with the owner showing her logo sketches while the smell of roasted beans filled the air. She nodded thoughtfully and said, "You've got something here. Let's do it." That one project paid barely enough to cover rent, but it opened a door. She told another shop owner who told her cousin who managed a food truck. Slowly, my portfolio grew. Daniel worked long hours at Swedish Medical Center, often dragging himself home after 12-hour ER shifts, but he never complained. Instead, he'd drop onto the couch, still smelling faintly of antiseptic, and ask, "How many clients today?" Maddie, I'd rattle off my wins, my setbacks, and he'd listen with the same attention he gave his patients. By the end of that year, I hired my first assistant, a college student named Rachel, who answered emails and kept me organized. Then came a junior designer, then another. By 2022, Clark Design Studio had 6 employees and an office space downtown. Walking into that office each morning, hearing the chatter of my team, seeing our work up on whiteboards, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. Daniel thrived too. In 2021, he was promoted to attending physician in the ER, his nameplate gleaming on the wall outside the break room. I attended the ceremony where his colleagues clapped and cheered, my chest swelling with pride. His parents, Mr. and Mrs. Chen, flew in from San Francisco, his mother clutching my hands with tears in her eyes. "Your family!" "Now," she told me, pressing dumplings into my palms she'd made from scratch. Their warmth was everything my own parents had denied me. Still, shadows had a way of finding me. One afternoon in early 2022, I walked into a meeting with a high-profile client, a boutique hotel chain. I was ready, slides polished, portfolio strong. But midway through the meeting, the CEO leaned back in his chair and frowned. "Clark Design Studio," he said slowly, tapping his pen. "Are you related to the Clarks in Everett?" My breath caught. "Why do you ask?" He exchanged a glance with his colleague. "Just something we heard. That one of their daughters. Well, that she passed away a few years ago. Strange coincidence with the name, isn't it?" Heat flooded my face. For a second, I couldn't breathe. I forced a smile, the kind that hurt. "I am Madison Clark, and as you can see, very much alive." The room went quiet. I powered through the rest of the presentation, every word tasting bitter. When I left, my hands shook so badly I almost dropped my laptop. That night I collapsed onto the couch, sobbing into Daniel's chest. Even here, even after everything I've built, they're still killing me with their lies. He stroked my hair, his voice steady. Then we make your life so undeniable that no one can question it. Every client, every project, every success. You prove it by living. Those words lit something inside me. I went back to the hotel chain portfolio in hand and looked the CEO straight in the eye. If you want proof of who I am, look at the work. Judge me by what I deliver, not by rumors from a small town. They signed the contract 2 weeks later. From then on, I stopped shrinking from the whispers. If Everett wanted me dead, I would counter with every piece of work that carried my name. If my parents wanted to bury me, I would build a company that screamed I was alive. Some nights, I still woke in a sweat, the image of Hannah holding flowers at a fake memorial flashing before me. But when I walked into my office each morning, greeted by the hum of my team and the walls lined with our designs, I told myself this was my resurrection. I had been erased, but here I was writing my own name back into the world, and I swore to myself that no one, not my father, not my mother, not even the gossip of an entire town, would ever take that away again. It was close to midnight, the hum of the city muffled by rain tapping against our apartment windows. I lay curled up on the couch with my phone glowing in my hand, scrolling mindlessly through Instagram half asleep. Then a photo stopped me cold. Hannah's face filled the screen, her smile wide and radiant, her hand held up to show a simple solitaire ring. Beside her stood a man I didn't recognize, tall with kind eyes, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist. The caption punched the air out of my lungs. He proposed at the beach where we had our first date. I can't wait to start this new chapter with you. I wish my sister Maddie could be here. She would have loved Michael. I know she's watching over us from heaven. The words blurred as my eyes filled with tears. My hand shook so badly I almost dropped the phone. Heaven. My sister thought I was in heaven. My own blood, my baby sister still believed the lie. A sob broke loose from my chest before I could stop it. The sound pulled Daniel from the kitchen where he was putting away dishes. He rushed over, dropping to his knees in front of me. Maddie. What is it? I shoved the phone into his hand. He read the caption silently, his lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes darkening. Oh, sweetheart. He pulled me into his arms as I cried, my body trembling against his chest. She doesn't know. She had no idea. I clutched his shirt, choking on my own words. She's mourning me, Daniel. She's living her life thinking her sister is gone, talking about me like I'm a ghost. He stroked my hair, trying to calm me, but I could feel the tension in his body. It's not fair. None of this is fair. But her wedding day isn't the time to drop a bomb like this. I jerked back, staring at him through swollen eyes. Her wedding day is the perfect time. All the lies, all the people who believed them, they'll all be in the same room. I can finally show them the truth. His brow furrowed. Think about what you're saying. Walking into a wedding and revealing you're alive, that's not just going to affect your parents. It will shatter Hannah in the middle of her vows. Do you really want her happiest day to be remembered for chaos? Anger flared inside me, mixing with the grief. What do you want me to do? Daniel, sit here and watch her post more tributes to a sister who isn't dead. Let her carry grief. She doesn't deserve to carry for the rest of her life. He hesitated, his hands tightening on my arms. I want you to protect yourself. You've worked so hard to rebuild, to heal. Do you really want to throw yourself back into that fire? I pulled away, pacing the living room, tears streaking my face. I've been running from that fire for 3 years and it's still burning me. No matter how much I build here, no matter how much we love each other, I'm still the girl who was buried alive by her own parents. And Hannah, she's the one I can't leave behind. Daniel leaned back against the couch, exhaustion etched across his face. I understand why you feel that way. But picture it. The dress, the vows, the guests. Do you really want to walk in like a ghost and steal her day from her? I stopped pacing, my chest heaving. I don't want to steal her day. I want to give her the truth. She deserves that much." Silence hung between us, the storm outside rattling against the glass. Daniel rubbed his forehead, his voice softer now. "If you're set on doing this, I can't stop you. But please, Maddie, think about the fallout. Once you walk through those doors, there's no going back." I looked down at my phone again. Hannah's smile frozen on the screen, the words watching over us from heaven, like a dagger in my heart. My decision hardened right then. I lifted my chin, meeting Daniel's weary gaze. I'm going. Whether it ruins me, whether it ruins them, I don't care. She's starting a new life, and I won't let her begin it under a lie. Daniel exhaled long and heavy, the sound of a man who knew he'd lost the fight. He reached for my hand, his thumb brushing over the scar on my cheek. "Then I'll stand by you when the pieces fall." I shook my head, squeezing his hand once before pulling it away. "Not this time. This is something I have to do alone." The room went still, the only sound the storm pounding outside. And inside me, beneath the fear and grief, a fierce resolve took root. Whatever waited at that church, I would face it. For Hannah, for myself. The highway curved north gray asphalt slick under the pale June sun. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as the sign appeared, "Welcome to Everett." The letters looked smaller than I remembered, but the weight behind them pressed down on my chest like a stone. The closer I got, the more everything looked the same. Rows of modest houses with porches sagging slightly, the grocery store with the faded awning, the diner that smelled of bacon grease no matter the hour. But it wasn't the same for me. For me, these streets were haunted. Every corner whispered gossip, every sidewalk carried footsteps of people who had mourned me at a memorial service I never attended. As I slowed at a stoplight, two older women crossed the street, both carrying church bulletins. They glanced at my car, their eyes lingering on me longer than they should have. One leaned into the other, whispering, her mouth curling into a look I knew too well. Everett's specialty gossip served hot and cruel. My chest tightened and I forced my gaze forward. Downtown Everett was busier than I remembered. The bakery window was filled with pies, the bookstore had a sign for a summer reading club. Families walked with children tugging at their hands, teenagers slouched in hoodies outside the coffee shop. Normal life, ordinary life, and yet I felt like an intruder walking into my own past. I pulled into the parking lot of the Hampton Inn just off Broadway. The building smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and stale carpet, but it was neutral ground, and that was all I needed. At the front desk, the clerk slid my key card across the counter. Val. She smiled politely, but her eyes lingered a second too long, her brow furrowing as though trying to place me. My pulse quickened, but she said nothing. Inside my room, I set my suitcase on the bed and pulled out the navy dress I had carefully packed, the scarf folded neatly beside it. I hung the dress on the closet door and stood in front of the mirror. My reflection stared back pale and taut, the scar on my cheek, a thin, silver line in the daylight. I lifted the silk scarf and wrapped it loosely, tilting my head until it fell just right. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than an accessory. Up close, it was a shield. I unpacked the rest in silence. Heels lined up by the wall clutch purse placed on the nightstand. The envelope with the newspaper clipping tucked carefully into the bag. My chest felt heavy, my breath shallow. Tomorrow was Hannah's wedding. Tomorrow the lies would unravel. Needing air, I stepped outside and began to walk the few blocks toward downtown. The sidewalks were cracked in the same places they'd been when I was a teenager. My feet remembered the paths, even though my heart resisted. As I passed the grocery store, I froze. Coming out with a bag of apples was Mrs. Henderson, who had lived across the street from us since I was a child. Her hair was grayer now, her shoulders more stooped, but her sharp eyes were unchanged. She looked straight at me and the bag slipped from her hand. Apples rolled across the pavement, one bouncing into the gutter. She clutched her chest, her lips parting. Lord have mercy. A ghost. My stomach flipped. For a second I thought I might faint. People on the sidewalk turned curious, following her gaze. Their eyes landed on me wide and uncertain. The air seemed to buzz with whispers, the sound of recognition mixed with disbelief. I bent quickly, scooping one of the apples, and held it out to her. My hand trembled as I said softly, "It's just me, Mrs. Henderson. Madison?" Her face drained of color. She took a step back, crossing herself, shaking her head as though refusing what her eyes told her. "You can't be. I went to your service. I heard them bury you." My throat burned. "They lied." I managed my voice rough. Before I could say more, she snatched the bag from my hand, backing away. People around us stared, murmuring, some pulling out phones. My cheeks burned heat climbing my neck. I turned on my heel, walking quickly back toward the hotel, each step echoing like a drumbeat in my ears. By the time I reached my room, my breath was ragged, my palms clammy. I slammed the door shut, leaning against it, eyes squeezed tight. I had wanted to stay invisible until the moment I chose to appear. Instead, Everett had already begun to see its ghost walking. I sat on the edge of the bed, scarf still clutched in my hand, and forced myself to breathe. The fear was real, but beneath it was something sharper. If the whispers had started, then the reckoning was closer than ever. Tomorrow there would be no running. The bells of St. John's tolled in the distance as I made my way up the block, each chime vibrating through my chest like a warning. My heels clicked against the pavement, steady but too loud in my ears, every step drawing me closer to the moment I had dreaded and longed for in equal measure. The church loomed ahead, red brick and tall stained glass windows, glowing with the late afternoon sun. My palms were damp against the clutch I carried. I wiped them on the silk scarf draped over my shoulders and pressed a hand against my racing heart. For a moment, I stood frozen at the bottom of the stone steps, the sounds of organ music drifting out through the open doors. Guests in suits and dresses flowed inside, chattering and laughing, their voices blending with the solemn chords. I waited until the crowd thinned before I climbed the steps, each one heavier than the last. Inside, cool air wrapped around me, carrying the familiar scent of old wood and candle wax. My breath caught as memories washed over me. Baptisms, Christmas services, choir recitals, where Hannah and I had stood side by side. Now I was a stranger in a place that had buried me alive. I slipped into the last pew, half hidden behind a column. From here I could see the backs of hundreds of heads, hats, and veils. The organ swelled as the wedding party began to file in. I hunched low, my fingers gripping the pew until my knuckles whitened. Then I saw her. Hannah. She glided down the aisle in a gown of white lace that shimmered under the light streaming through the stained glass. Her hair was swept into an elegant bun with tiny pearls woven through. She carried a bouquet of roses and baby's breath, the same flowers she had loved since we were children. Her smile was radiant, but her eyes, I saw it immediately. Behind the joy there was a shadow, a sorrow she carried like a hidden scar. Tears stung my eyes, blurring her image. My little sister, so beautiful, so grown, and yet still the girl who once clutched my hand in the dark when thunderstorms rattled our bedroom windows. She thought I was gone. She had mourned me. And here she was, stepping into her new life without knowing the truth. The ceremony began, Pastor Williams speaking in his deep, measured voice about love, about faith, about unity. My parents sat in the front row, stiff and composed. I recognized my father's profile jaw set like stone, my mother's handkerchief trembling in her lap. Neither turned back, neither looked around. To them, I didn't exist. I tried to steady my breathing as Hannah and Michael joined hands at the altar. The hush that fell over the congregation was suffocating. My pulse hammered in my ears as Hannah began her vows, her voice clear but soft. She spoke about finding someone who understood her, about choosing love despite loss. And then she said my name. Her voice caught, and she blinked rapidly, her smile trembling. "Michael, you've helped me heal from a grief I thought would break me forever. My sister Maddie was the best big sister anyone could ask for." I know she's watching over us from heaven. And I promise to love you with all my heart, including the pieces that will always belong to her." The words hit me like a blade. My hand flew to my mouth to stifle the cry rising in my throat. My body lurched forward as if to stand, to shout, to tear away the veil of lies in front of everyone. But I froze, my legs trembling, my vision swimming. My nails dug into the wood of the pew as I forced myself back down. My chest heaved, my lungs desperate for air. I couldn't ruin her vows, not now, not like this. Tears spilled down my face as I bit the inside of my cheek to keep silent. Every syllable of her promise carved deeper into me. She believed I was gone. She had built her vows on that grief. And all I could do was sit in the shadows, shaking a ghost at the back of the church. The organ swelled again, drowning the sound of my ragged breathing. Hannah smiled through her tears as the pastor pronounced them husband and wife. The congregation rose to its feet in applause, a sea of joy crashing against the quiet storm building inside me. I stayed seated, my body rigid, my heart breaking and burning all at once, holding back the scream that clawed at my throat. The ballroom at Riverside Country Club glowed with chandeliers, their light bouncing off crystal glasses and polished silverware. Laughter rose above the music, a tide of voices filling the space as waiters carried trays of champagne. The scent of roses and buttercream clung to the air, sweet and heavy. I lingered just outside the French doors, my hand pressed to the glass, my pulse pounding in my throat. Inside, Hannah was radiant in her gown, her cheeks flushed from dancing. Michael stood beside her, beaming his arms steady at her back. They looked like a painting of new beginnings framed by 200 people cheering them on. I waited, forcing my breath to slow. This was the moment I had promised myself. No more hiding. The DJ tapped the microphone announcing the bouquet toss. The unmarried women gathered on the dance floor, laughing and jostling one another. Hannah held the bouquet high, the ivory roses glowing under the lights. She lifted her chin, her eyes sweeping over the crowd, and then she paused. Her voice carried across the room, soft but strong. "This bouquet, it's for my sister Maddie. Wherever she is, I know she's watching over me." The room hushed, reverent. Guests smiled sadly, some bowing their heads. Hannah's hand trembled slightly, the bouquet trembling with it. My legs moved before my mind could catch up. I pushed open the French doors. The hinges creaked. Cool night air spilled into the warmth of the ballroom as I stepped inside. My heels clicked against the marble floor. Heads turned. Whispers rippled like a wave. 200 pairs of eyes followed me, wide with confusion, disbelief. The music died, cut off mid-note. Hannah's arm froze mid-arc. The bouquet slipped from her fingers, tumbling to the floor with a soft thud. She stared at me as if I'd risen from the grave. Michael's brow furrowed, his body shifting instinctively in front of her, his arm tightening protectively. I stood there in my navy dress scarf draped around my shoulders, my breath shaking but steady, my gaze locked on Hannah's tears already welling in her eyes. The silence broke with the scrape of a chair. My father shot to his feet, his face pale, then crimson, his hands gripping the edge of the table. His voice tore through the stillness, sharp and cracking. "Why are you still alive?" Gasps filled the room. Guests twisted in their seats, some covering their mouths, others frozen. My mother collapsed back into her chair, her hand clutching at her chest, her handkerchief dropping to the floor. Hannah swayed her lips, parting soundlessly, her eyes never leaving mine. Michael whispered something to her, but she didn't answer. The words hung in the air like smoke, choking and undeniable. My father's shout had ripped through the facade he had built, exposing everything he had tried to bury. For a long second, no one moved. The music had stopped, the laughter gone. All that remained was the echo of his question reverberating in the silence of 200 witnesses. And in that silence, every lie began to crumble. I straightened my shoulders, forcing down the tremor in my chest. My father's words still hung in the air, sharp as a blade, but I refused to let them cut me. My voice rose clear and steady, carrying to the far corners of the ballroom. I'm alive because your lies couldn't kill me. You buried me with your words, but I refused to stay dead. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Whispers spread like wildfire. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the folded newspaper clipping, its edges worn from being held too many times. My hand didn't shake as I raised it high for everyone to see. Here it is. Everett Daily Herald, January 12, 2020. My memorial service. While I was lying in a hospital bed fighting for my life, my parents stood in front of you all and pretended I was gone. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, then broke into shocked murmurs. Guests craned their necks trying to glimpse the paper in my hand. From the center of the room, a chair scraped against the floor. Aunt Carol stood slowly, her voice trembling but firm. I never believed it. I told you all something was wrong. I knew Madison wasn't gone. My mother's face went ashen, her hand fluttering uselessly at her throat. My father's complexion turned a deep purple, veins bulging at his temple. Before either of them could speak, Hannah stumbled forward, the lace of her gown catching against a chair. Her eyes were wide, shining with tears, her lips parted in disbelief. Then she ran, straight into my arms. Her body slammed against mine, and she clung to me as if she might never let go. "Oh my God," she sobbed, her voice breaking against my shoulder. "You're alive, you're here. 3 years. 3 years I thought you were gone." How could they? I held her, my own tears finally spilling, though my voice stayed strong. "I'm here, Hannah. I never stopped loving you. They lied to you. They lied to everyone." Behind her, Michael hovered his hand, hovering protectively at her back, confusion etched across his face, but his eyes warm and steady as they landed on me. The room erupted into chaos. Guests stood, some shouting questions, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Phones were lifted, photos snapped. The sound of whispers grew into a roar. My father stepped forward, his voice booming. "Enough of this. She abandoned this family. She is no daughter of mine." Hannah whipped around, her mascara streaked down her cheeks, her voice trembling with fury. "You let me grieve at a grave that didn't even exist. You let me cry myself to sleep for 3 years while my sister was alive. How dare you?" My mother stumbled forward, reaching for Hannah. "Sweetheart, please, we thought it was best." "Best." Hannah's voice cracked into a scream that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "Best for who? For your pride. For your church friends. You chose your reputation over your own daughter's life." Richard's fists clenched at his sides, his eyes darting between me and the crowd watching him unravel. He tried to steady his voice, but it shook with rage. "We did what had to be done." "No," Hannah spat, her gown swishing as she stepped closer to him. "You did what was easiest for you, and now you don't get to stand here and pretend this is your day. This is my wedding, and you don't belong here." My mother gasped. "Hannah, get out!" Hannah screamed, her finger pointing straight at them. "Both of you, get out of my wedding!" The ballroom froze. Every eye turned to the front row where my parents stood, trembling under the weight of their daughter's fury. The silence stretched for a beat, then another. My father's lips curled, but for once no words came. Slowly, shame and shock twisting their faces, Richard and Margaret turned toward the exit. Guests parted silently as they walked through, whispers following them like shadows. The heavy doors closed behind them with a thud that seemed to shake the floor. Hannah collapsed against me again, her sobs raw, her body shaking. Around us, people still murmured, some with tears, others filming. But in that moment, none of it mattered. I held my sister tight, feeling the years of lies shatter around us. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I had finally come home. The next morning, the sky over Everett was gray, heavy with clouds, the kind that promised rain but hadn't quite delivered yet. Hannah called me just after sunrise, her voice raw but steady. "Meet me at the diner," she said. "The one on Main Street. The booth by the window." When I pushed open the door, the smell of bacon and coffee hit me just like it always had when we were kids. The vinyl seats were the same faded red, the jukebox in the corner still humming low. Hannah was already there, still in the same sweater she had thrown on the night before after changing out of her gown. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, her face bare and pale eyes swollen from crying. I slid into the booth across from her. For a moment neither of us spoke. We just stared at each other, two sisters who had lived through the impossible. Finally, she broke the silence. "Tell me everything. Don't leave anything out." So I did. My voice shook at first, but once I started, the words poured out. I told her about that night in Seattle, the rain, the semi-truck, the hospital, about waking up bandaged and broken, about Daniel sleeping by my bed, about the moment he told me that our parents had declared me dead. Hannah's hands flew to her mouth, tears brimming in her eyes. "They said you were gone. I went to your grave, Maddie. I brought flowers. I talked to you. I thought you were cold in the ground, and all that time you were alive." I nodded, swallowing hard. "I saw the article. I saw your quote, the things you said about me. Do you know what that felt like, to read my own obituary while I was still breathing?" Her tears spilled over then. "I was grieving you every day. Every birthday, every Christmas, every night I lay awake wondering why God took you. I thought you were in heaven watching me. I prayed to you." The ache in her voice was unbearable. I reached across the table and took her hand, squeezing it tight. "You were never talking to a ghost. I was alive, Hannah. I was just erased. And I was too scared to come back, too broken. But I never stopped loving you." We sat there, our hands clasped, while the waitress came by and silently set down 2 mugs of coffee. Neither of us touched them. When Hannah finally spoke again, her voice was harder, steadier. "They don't get to do this to us anymore. We don't owe them anything. We can choose our family from here on out." I nodded. "We don't let their lies define us. We don't let their pride destroy what we have left." Later that afternoon, word spread quickly. I heard from Aunt Carol that Richard and Margaret had skipped Sunday service. The whispers had already begun. The Clarks who buried their own daughter alive, the Clarks who lied to their whole community. The same friends who once sat at their dinner table turned their backs, crossing the street when they passed. For people who cared more about reputation than love, it was the sharpest punishment possible. Back in Seattle, Daniel finally met Michael. We all gathered in our apartment one evening, Chinese takeout spread across the table. The 2 men shook hands, and soon enough they were leaning over cartons of lo mein, laughing about baseball stats and hospital stories. Watching them, I felt something loosen in my chest, as if the world was finally stitching itself back together. Hannah and I started calling each other daily, filling in 3 years of silence, with stories of classrooms, clients, heartbreak, and hope. She came to visit Clark Design Studio, meeting my team, marveling at the life I had built. I drove down to Portland to see the house she and Michael were buying, the little backyard where she dreamed of planting roses. And through it all, our parents stayed silent. No phone calls, no letters, only silence. For once, I didn't chase it. I didn't beg for their love. I didn't need it anymore. One evening, as I sat on the balcony of our Seattle apartment with Daniel sipping tea while the city lights glittered below, I thought back to that night at the country club. My father's voice rang in my head, sharp and furious. "Why are you still alive?" And I realized the truth. I hadn't truly lived until that moment. I had survived the crash. I had survived the lies, but standing there in front of 200 witnesses and declaring my life back, that was when I chose to live on my own terms. So if you were in my shoes, if your family once declared you dead to save their pride, what would you do? Would you stay silent to keep the peace, or would you stand up in front of the world and tell the truth?